Canada is now facing a problem that many policymakers did not expect to arrive this quickly. After years of rapid population growth, the country entered a period of decline in late 2025, marking the first annual population decrease since Confederation. The immigration cuts introduced to relieve pressure on housing were supposed to slow growth, not push the country into contraction. But that is what has happened, and the consequences are now spreading across the economy. The article argues that Canada will eventually have to raise immigration again because the current slowdown is already exposing major weaknesses. Population growth has stalled, the number of non-permanent residents has dropped sharply, and natural population growth has turned negative, meaning deaths have begun to outnumber births. At the same time, international student arrivals have fallen, work permit numbers have weakened, and key sectors that relied on newcomers are starting to feel the strain. The economic argument is central to the piece. Reduced immigration is projected to weaken real GDP in both 2025 and 2026, while overall population is expected to contract further. This matters because a smaller population means fewer consumers, weaker spending, lower business revenues, and less tax income for governments. The article says, the pain is already visible in retail, post-secondary education, housing construction, and service industries that were built around steady growth in population and demand. The demographic case may be even more serious. Canada now has an ultra-low fertility rate that is far below replacement level, and that means population growth can no longer rely on births. The country is also aging rapidly. As more people retire and fewer young workers enter the labor force, immigration becomes the only realistic way to keep the workforce from shrinking. Without sustained immigration, the article says, Canada risks falling into a cycle of slower growth, labor shortages, weaker tax revenues, and rising pressure on public services such as healthcare and pensions. The article also lays out how the damage is appearing sector by sector. Universities and colleges are under pressure because international students provided a major source of revenue. Healthcare is facing even more stress because immigrant workers have long filled shortages in nursing, caregiving, and other critical roles. Construction faces a deep contradiction. Immigration cuts were meant to help housing affordability by reducing demand, but many of the workers needed to build homes also come through immigration channels. So Canada may be lowering demand while also weakening its ability to increase supply. Another major theme in the article is that governments often react using outdated data. The immigration cuts announced in late 2024 were based on conditions that had already started changing by the time the measures took effect. Housing markets were beginning to cool, labor conditions were shifting, and the full demographic weakness of Canada was becoming clearer. By the time the policy was implemented, the country was no longer dealing only with a housing crisis. It was beginning to face an economic growth crisis. In that sense, the article says, current policy may be solving yesterday's problem while creating tomorrow's. Still, the article does not argue for a return to the old model without changes. Instead, it says, Canada needs immigration done more intelligently and more regionally. The biggest mistake of the previous expansion was not simply high numbers, but poor distribution. Too many newcomers were concentrated in markets like Toronto and Vancouver, where housing was already stretched, while many smaller regions with jobs and available housing struggled to attract or retain workers. The article suggests future increases should be tied to regional housing capacity, labor shortages, and infrastructure readiness, with stronger incentives and rules to support settlement outside the biggest pressure points. In the end, the article reaches a clear conclusion. Canada cannot remain on a path of population decline, weak birth rates, an aging workforce, and lower immigration without paying a growing economic price. The debate is no longer really about whether immigration will need to rise again. The real debate is about when the pressure becomes too strong for policymakers to ignore. The article's core message is that this reversal is coming sooner than many expect, and that Canada should prepare now to do it in a smarter, more balanced way.